Hello and welcome back. This is going to be another haul from the Book Thing of Baltimore, which is a wonderful nonprofit that gives out free books every weekend and also accepts donations of any unwanted books you have. Once again, I tried to be really restrained in my book gathering, and unfortunately I was not quite as restrained as last time, but that means more for you to look at. First, I got a collection of short stories called While the Messiah Tarries. I don't actually really know what this is about. I just sort of glanced at the back, and I just love the title so much. So I may wind up reading a couple and deciding it's not for me, but we shall see. Then I got Wolf Among Wolves by Hans Fallada. Hans Fallada is an author who has sort of enjoyed a renaissance in the past maybe couple of years. He was writing in Germany in the 30s and 40s. And I'm really interested in German literature, so of course I snapped this one up. I have not read anything of his yet. Then I got another classic, Life in the Iron Mills by Rebecca Harding Davis. Or actually this is Life in the Iron Mills and Other Stories. And The Little Town by Heinrich. I will confess, I have other than Thomas Mann, I have a lot of trouble keeping my Manns straight. So I think this is Thomas Mann's brother. I believe Klaus Mann, who wrote Mephisto, is Thomas Mann's son. But either way, I'm eager to read something by either Thomas Mann's brother or his son. And then I got this book, which is actually called Shift. But on the cover it says, "Did LSD kill JFK?" And this is an advanced reading copy apparently, and it looks like the book actually just came out. And it's written by, the first author's name is Tim Kring, who apparently is the creator of the show Heroes, which I've never watched. But the co-author is Dale Peck, who is one of my all-time favorite critics, possibly my all-time favorite critic. And he wrote he has an anthology out called Hatchet Jobs of his critical writing, which perhaps gives you an idea of the tone his criticism often used to take. In the preface to that book, he says he's never going to write another hatchet job again. But he can be really tough, and there are a lot of people in the literary and critical world who just don't like him. They think he's unprofessional, they think he's mean, boo-hoo-hoo, and they think he's bringing the literary discourse down or whatever. And honestly, I think it's the people who write bad novels and then get them lauded by sycophants who are bringing the literary discourse down, but whatever. So I highly recommend Hatchet Jobs by Dale Peck. He's also written some novels, the only one of which I've read so far is Martin and John, or that's the US title. The UK title is a little racier, but it also has Martin in the title. And I read his children's book, Drift House, which was a really good children's book. So he can do it all. Maybe he could even co-write this "Did LSD kill JFK" thing. We'll see. Also, I'm assuming that means Dale Peck actually wrote it and that Tim Kring just has his name on it. I don't really know though. And then I got another novel, Totem Pole. And Institutes of the Christian Religion by Thomas Calvin. I'm interested in theology, and particularly in Calvinism and the Puritan religions, so what the heck, it's pretty big. I'll probably read it someday. And, this is Memory Wire by Robert Charles Wilson. This is one of those books that I feel a little bit guilty about getting because I have several other books by Robert Charles Wilson that I just have not read yet. But he wrote this wonderful, wonderful novel called Spin that, gosh, it's probably been 5 years, 6 years since it came out. But it was just a wonderful science fiction novel, and the kind of science fiction I love to read, where there are just a lot of big ideas, but the characters don't get sacrificed. It's just a great novel that just happens to be science fiction. So I really want to read more of his stuff. Unfortunately, Spin is the only one I've had time to read so far, but I keep collecting them anyway. And I got American Lit Relit by Richard Armour. Richard Armour is the author of a wonderful book called Twisted Tales from Shakespeare, which is just a complete send-up and massacre of the Shakespeare plots. Although I think I read that. I read it when I was pretty little, or not little, but pretty young. I think I read it before I'd even read any Shakespeare plays. And what's funny is that through the humor, he actually does teach you a lot about the plays, even though he completely rips the plots, etc. to shreds. So this is another humorous literature send-up by him. And then I got Modern Library, an anthology of light verse. I just kind of collect Modern Library volumes, and this was there. Then I got this novel called Sway by Zachary Lazar. This is a novel about it's about Keith Richards, Kenneth Anger, the filmmaker, and Bobby Beausoleil, who was a disciple of Charles Manson. And as you know, as I've said over and over again, I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction. And actually with the 1960s and 1970s, I find that there were a lot of good novels written then that just are not really in print anymore, that just nobody's really heard of, or they're sort of vaguely in the public consciousness because somebody made a movie out of it or something like that, but that are really good and really better for getting a feel for the times. But because my interest in the 60s and 70s is not only historical but historiographical, I'm also interested in what people today make of the decade. So I will read historical novels about the 60s and 70s, even though they're written by people who couldn't possibly have lived them. So I'm willing to give this a try. Then I got another collection of stories, Rain in the Wind by Saichi Maria. And novel Homecoming by Jiro Osaragi. I was interested in this because it's a novel of the post-war Japanese experience, actually written by a Japanese person as opposed to, you know, some American or whatever take on what it must have been like then. And James Michener says that it conveys exactly the many curious states of the Japanese mind which no Occidental reader could hope to catch. So heck, you know, if James Michener is behind it. And then I got this novel, The Crying Game by John Brain. This actually has nothing to do with the film, which I love the film The Crying Game. It's one of my favorite films. But it's written by John Brain, who was one of the angry young men and whose most famous novel was Room at the Top, which I own and have not read yet, surprise, surprise. But I decided to give this one a whirl as well. And then I got Clea and Zeus Divorce by Emily Prager. I'm not really sure what this is. I mean, obviously it's a novel, but the reason I picked it up was that back in the day, I think maybe late 80s, early 90s, vintage contemporaries used to be just the most gorgeous books out there. And they all had these amazing spines with this color block that has the author's name. There's all different colors on the different spines. And they would have slightly different fonts for the titles. A lot of the books are really good too. I'm not completely shallow. But I sort of collect them, and then if I read them and don't like them, I get rid of them. But anything that's published in that series, I tend to give a chance to. So whatever this is, I'm going to give it a chance. Then I got this novel, Obsession by Ramsey Campbell. Ramsey Campbell is a famous horror writer, and a lot of the horror I read just doesn't scare me. It just doesn't work for me. But he's so famous, I decided to give it a try, and this sounded kind of interesting. And then I got Conjure Wife by Fritz Lieber. This is the basis for a really enjoyable campy film I watched pretty recently called Weird Woman, which starred Lon Chaney, I believe Lon Chaney Jr. So I'm curious to read the source material. And then I got this French novel, L'Île, or The Island, by Robert Merle. And last but not least, I got this kind of interesting book called The Gimmick, Spoken American and English. But what's interesting is that this is actually a French book that's a guide to American and English usage. And I thought that could be really interesting and useful. So, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me for my next video.